Hello, and welcome to my tutorial series on how to make a 2D platformer in Unity. In this video, we're going to start adding a jump to our character, just like Mario has here. Let's get started. So Mario has some very distinct features to his jumps. He can run and do these little jumps, or he can run and do a very big jump. And we want to be able to put all of these into our game. So to get started, we're going to go over here to our Fabio game, open up our Fabio C# script. We're going to create another private float, but it's going to be a serialized field like we had last time, so it will be public. So I'm going to copy this one and paste it by hitting Control V, and then I'm going to change it to jump speed Y with a semicolon at the end. And then I'm going to have a bunch of new private bools. I'm going to have a private bool, and it's going to be called isGrounded. And then I'm going to have another private bool, and this one is going to be called isJumping. Another private bool. It's going to be 4 in total that are going to be new. And this is going to be called jump button held. And the last one is going to be jump button released. And I'm also going to add something new, and it's going to go right up here with our rigid body. So I'm just basically just keeping everything together based on what type of category it is. Here's our horizontal movement. Here's going to be our vertical movement. I'm going to keep the bools separate, and the other things I'm just going to keep up here, and you can organize how you want, and I'll show you how to also organize it in the editor a little better later on. But that's going to be a public layer mask, and it's going to be called ground layers, and we'll get to that in a second. And also what we're going to add is a private transform that's going to be called F for Fabio underscore ground check 1 comma space F underscore ground check 2. Now, we haven't quite declared a variable like this. I have a comma here, but I'm actually using it to declare 2 different variables. So if you write if you declare anything here, be it a float or whatever, you can simply you can list more than one on one line by simply having a comma between them. So there's 2 variables here. Instead of writing out private transform F ground check 1, then semicolon, and then the next line, and writing again private transform ground check 2 semicolon, I can just combine these 2 declared variables on the same line with the use of this comma right here. And you can do it also to all these floats. I could have just write serialized private float, and I just could have put all these here: minimum walk speed, walk acceleration X, max walk speed X, and so on. I just could have put a comma between each one and then declared the numbers later on, but that would have been a little messy. Since there's only going to be 2 of these things, it's much easier just to do it with this one. So now to explain what we're going to do before we do it, let's go back here to our Fabio game, and what we want to do obviously is to have our character jump, and there are a number of ways in which to approach this. The basic approach, or the overall idea of it, is that we want to do 2 things. We want Fabio here to be able to identify he's on the ground. We want it rather than in the air. So the very first thing we have to do is be able to tell him whether or not he is grounded, and that comes back to this bool right here, is grounded. Throughout the code, we want to say, okay, Fabio is on the ground. We also want to be able to identify when he's jumping, and you'll see in a little bit why that is, because if he's in the air, we don't want him to continually jump. So we want to shut off his jumping when he is jumping, so he doesn't keep jumping into infinity. So that's where one of the ways actually we will use is jumping and is grounded. Now we came up here and we identified some things such as this ground check and these ground layers. So going back to Unity, what we want to do actually is we want to be able to use one of these two things right here to identify to the code that we are standing on the ground. We have to tell the code what the ground is. And we can do this in one of two ways. We can use a tag or a layer. And the difference between these two is that a layer will allow us to use a little bit of functionality. We can do things like ignore collisions and raycasts and stuff like that. In fact, one of these is right here. One of the things we can do with a layer is ignore raycast. And I do have another video series in which I use raycast for jumping, and you can go and check out that. I'm not going to go into too much of what raycasts are, but just know that we use layers for when we want to use functionality. A tag is when we don't want to use a functionality and we simply just want to label it in our code. So we're going to create two more game objects, and we're going to put it on our Fabio character. We're going to go up here and we're going to highlight our Fabio character. We're going to right click and we're going to go down to create empty. And we're going to call the first game object ground check 1. And then we're simply going to hit Control C and then Control V. And then we're going to make a copy of this. And I'm going to right click again. And I'm going to go to rename. And I'm going to call this one ground check 2. Let's go back to our scene so we can find our two objects here. So here is ground check 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to put this on the bottom of his foot, the very bottom right there. That's where we're going to put the first one. Ground check 1 will go on his left foot. Maybe we'll put it just a little bit below. I think that's good right there. We can always adjust it later. And then ground check 2 will be somewhere in the same position. Actually, let's double check this. It's negative 3.5. And let's put this actually at the same distance. Let's change this to just 0.35 and the height of it, let's say negative 0.7, and we'll make this one match in the same way, that way. So that way ground check 1 and ground check 2 are equal distance from each other. And we haven't discussed really too much about children of objects, actually. I kind of rushed ahead. So Fabio is a game object, and by right-clicking and putting it under, see how this is indented a little bit, and this is kind of too? This is now a child of the Fabio game object. In fact, if I were to move Fabio, if I lift him up like this, you'll see that ground check 1 and 2 are in the same spots in conjunction of the parent object. This would be called a parent object. Fabio is the parent object, and ground check 1 and ground check 2, they are the child objects. They are children of it. No matter where I move Fabio, ground check 1 and ground check 2 will move exactly with him. And so we'll just move him back a second and down. And the idea behind these two objects is that when these things come in contact, when these game objects, ground check 1 and ground check 2, come in contact with the ground, it's going to allow us to declare Fabio as being grounded. When he's touching the ground, he's grounded. And we're going to use these game objects for that. And we created two of them because sometimes, if I go back to my other game here, the completed project, sometimes, Mario can be, oops. Let's just put it back. Sometimes Mario here can be, if I move him up, over, he can sometimes just be on the edge of an object, and we want him to jump, and that way we have one for each of his feet when he's on these very edges, like that. So now we're going to go back into our script, in our Fabio script, and right here in the start function, we're going to go ahead and say F underscore ground check 1. And we're going to say that's going to equal transform dot find with a capital F, And then we're going to create a parentheses, then a quotation mark. And inside that quotation mark, we're going to write ground check 1. And at the end of it, we're going to put a semicolon. And you have to make sure that in this parentheses, you write ground check 1 like this, or however you named this game object up here. See, it says ground check 1. Ground and check and 1 are 3 different words, with ground being a capital G and this being a capital C. You have to make sure this is written in the exact same manner inside these quotation marks. Otherwise, it's not going to know what it's looking for, because here it's going to say, hey, I'm defining this ground check 1 right here as it's going to be equal to a transform that I'm looking for with this name. And remember, every game object has a transform. It's saying, hey, I'm looking for a transform. Its name is ground check 1. So going back here, we're simply going to duplicate this. We're going to copy. We can go to the next line, Control V to paste, and we're simply going to change this other one to ground check 2, so that as soon as the game starts, the very first thing it's going to go get our rigid body, and it's also going to go find our ground check game objects. So next we're going to go ahead and we're going to define our bool here is grounded. So we're going to go down here to our update function right here, and right below face direction X, we're going to write is grounded, and it's going to be equal to physics 2D dot overlap point, and then it's going to be F underscore ground check point 1 dot position, and then we're going to have a comma, and we're going to put the word ground layers. And then right here, we're going to put these 2 vertical lines. And I don't believe we've used this before. I don't see it. So right here, when we put these 2 vertical lines like this, this means or. Just like this means and. So we're saying it's grounded physics 2D dot overlap point, or, and we're basically now going to write the same thing over again. Actually, I'm just going to go ahead and just make things quick. We're just going to copy and paste this right here. Left click, right click, Control V. At the end of this, we're going to put a semicolon. So we're defining is grounded. Is grounded is going to be physics 2D dot overlap point, which is very much like what it says. It's a physics 2D code, and it has overlap points. There's going to be 2 points that are going to overlap. 1 point is going to be our ground check point 1, and over here ground check point 2, depending on where it touches, which is one's right here, and the other one's right there. And so if this point, comma, or the ground layer, which we're going to use in a second. So we're going to put the ground layer on the block. So when the checkpoint and the ground layer or the block are overlapping, when they're touching, then our character is going to be grounded. It's going to say he is grounded. So that's going to be the definition of him touching the ground. The game object, the ground checkpoint, and the ground layer have to overlap, which only makes sense. And then we're going to say, or the same thing, only we're applying, we got to fix it, ground check 2. So when ground check 1 and the ground are touching, or ground check 2 and the ground are touching, then our character is going to be grounded, and then we can jump when he is grounded. All right, something to fix I see right here. This should not just be, it should be F underscore ground check, not ground check point, because that's not how we have it labeled above. Let's save on that. And then we'll go to the top here, and here we have, this should be a 2. So we should have F ground check 1, F ground check 2, just like we have up here. And these things should be this way down here. We'll hit save on all of that and go back into Unity. So now let's go ahead and create our layer for our layer mask. We're going to go up here to the layer box and we're going to go to add layer. And right here in user layer 3, we're going to write the word ground for our ground layer. And then we're going to go back to our Fabio game object and we're going to scroll all the way down here. And you can see we have ground layers and it has nothing. And then we can choose from all the ground layers that are listed, we'll just click on ground. But just to point out that if we go back up down here, these are listed also up here. We'll just leave that as default because we don't need to add a layer for Fabio. We just need to add one for the ground. However, actually first let's go back into the script and let's go up here to our private bool. And let's just for a second make this a public bool. And then go back here. And what we have now is that we have a little box that will populate if he's grounded. However, if I hit play, you're going to see that it's not populating because he needs a collider that's a trigger. And we have a composite collider 2D right here. It's not labeled a trigger. There's a difference between a collider, which is the physical collision box here for him to sit on, and something that can act as a trigger, meaning he's just encountering it. It won't be physical. However, if I try to switch this to trigger, these colliders can't be both at the same time. He's going to fall right through it. So what we're going to need is to add another box collider 2D to this. And we're going to label it as a trigger. And as you can see, it's just real big right here. So we'll go ahead and shrink it down. And when I hit it, it had these little green boxes. And this is what you use to resize the object. So now we have the collider on it from the stand on, but we also have a trigger on him to stand on also, or for him to use as a trigger for his jumping. And as we make our ground bigger, we'll just increase it, but we'll leave it exactly like that for now. And if I hit play now, the box populates, meaning that he is grounded. And if I actually, let's go up here and we'll go here and we'll just watch this for a second. We'll lift him up. He's not touching the ground. I let him go. He falls to the ground and now he is grounded. So we're going to stop right here today. In the next video, we're going to add our jump controls to our character. As always, thank you for watching. Like this video, subscribe to my channel, follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and support me on Patreon. And a big special thanks to all my Patreon supporters. See you next time.